you ever feel like you're losing your mind, not because of one big event, but because you're simply too tired of pretending? You smile in public, you play your role, yet every night you lie awake, haunted by a sense that something is deeply wrong. The laughter feels forced, the love feels unsafe, and the mask you've worn for years is starting to crack. Psychology calls this unprocessed trauma. The buried wounds that live in your body reshape your nervous system and whisper that you're never enough. This is how madness begins, not sudden, but through exhaustion. But before we look at how adulthood begins to crack, pause for a moment. Imagine what it would mean if you could finally trace the madness back to its roots. If you could see clearly where the mask began, why the exhaustion never lifts, and how the past still breathes inside the present. Stay until the end of this story, and you will not only understand why the mind unravels, but you may also recognize the hidden patterns in your own life. The whispers your body has carried for years. EJ, what begins in darkness may also reveal a path toward light. You don't simply wake up one day and lose your mind. It happens slowly, like a weight pressing down day after day until you can't breathe. It begins with the nights when sleep will not come. Your body is exhausted, but your thoughts refuse to stop. The clock moves, the world is quiet, yet you lie there replaying every failure, every regret, every fear. Insomnia turns into dread, dread turns into anger, and anger turns into silence that isolates you from everyone around you. Relationships no longer feel safe. You push people away the moment they get too close, then panic and beg them not to leave. Push, pull, repeat. The cycle leaves you drained. Love stops feeling like comfort and starts feeling like combat. Arguments cut deeper, reconciliations never last. You find yourself both starting the fire and trying to put it out, unsure which part of you is real anymore. There are mornings when you look in the mirror and feel nothing. The face staring back seems foreign, like a mask you've worn too long. Even your dreams betray you. They come in fragments, disconnected, confusing, often frightening. You wake up more tired than when you went to bed, trapped in a loop where neither waking nor sleeping offers relief. The exhaustion seeps into your bones, and you wonder how long you can keep functioning this way. How long before someone notices what you've been hiding? This is not weakness. Psychologists call it unprocessed trauma. Pain that was never acknowledged, wounds that were never allowed to heal. Over time, it embeds itself into your body and rewires your nervous system. You become hyper-aware, quick to anger, quick to collapse. Your mind bends under the strain, but it cannot bend forever. Even the strongest branch will eventually snap. And then reality itself starts to shift. You hear voices when no one is speaking. You see patterns in ordinary things, a flicker of light, a passing word, that feel like hidden messages meant only for you. The world stops being predictable and starts to feel hostile, overwhelming, incomprehensible. You know it sounds irrational, but it feels undeniable. This is what going crazy really feels like. Not a sudden break, but a long unraveling. Not a spectacle, but an exhaustion. It's the slow erosion of trust, of safety, of self. By the time others notice, you've already been fighting battles inside your head for years. To understand why people go crazy, we have to look further back, to the origins of those wounds in childhood, where the first cracks were made. Eli was not born to be broken. As a child, his eyes lit up with wonder, his voice filled with curiosity, his dreams painted in colors too bright for the walls that held them. He asked questions endlessly, believing that answers were safe to find. But the world inside his home never answered with safety. His father would arrive late, carrying rage in his body, spilling it into every room. His mother would retreat into silence, disappearing even when she sat just a few feet away. The house was not a place to rest, but a field to survive. Eli learned to tiptoe through creaking floorboards, each step calculated like crossing landmines. Imagine being so young and already mapping danger in your own home. The dinner table, meant for connection, became a battlefield. Words were sharpened into weapons, arguments hurled like grenades, silence used as armor. And when the smoke cleared, no apology ever came. The war was reset every evening, and Eli sat in the middle, absorbing wounds that left no visible scar. How does a child learn love when every meal is served with conflict? Yet the deepest wound was not the anger, not even the silence. It was the denial, the pretending, the smiles worn in public, the forced laughter at gatherings, the facade of a family that looked whole from the outside. Teachers praised his manners. Neighbors nodded at his politeness. No one ever said, "Something here is wrong." So Eli learned that pain must be hidden, that truth must be silenced, that reality itself could not be trusted. And here lies the seed of future madness. What happens to a child who is never allowed to name his hurt? He grows up doubting his own perception. He learns to mistrust his feelings. He wears masks so well that eventually even he forgets what is underneath. But the body does not forget. The nervous system holds the memory. The silence rots into shame. The shame twists into rage, and the rage left unspoken begins to fracture the mind. This is why people go crazy. Not because they are weak, but because as children they were forced to carry wars they could not win, lies they could not name, silences they could not break. Ellie's madness did not appear in adulthood by chance. It was planted here, in this childhood, in this house, at this table. And the cracks formed then would only deepen with time. By the time Ellie was 5, Ellie learned one lesson above all else. To survive, he had to become someone else. He studied every sound, every silence, every shift in the room, and he reshaped himself to match. If his father's voice thundered, Ellie shrank. If his mother retreated, Ellie filled the air with humor. If peace demanded obedience, he obeyed. Each day, each year, another mask was added. This is the life of the chameleon child, sometimes called the invisible child, a child who survives not by being real, but by being whatever others need him to be. It works in the short term. Teachers see a polite boy, neighbors see a cheerful son, friends see a clever companion. But applause for the performance comes at a terrible cost, because when the mask grows, the self beneath withers. And what is madness if not the slow disappearance of the self? Inside, Eli was hollow. His inner world resembled a burnt-out room. The walls still stood, but the warmth, the soul, the center were gone. This hollowness is not neutral, it is dangerous. A mind without a secure core cannot anchor itself. It bends, it adapts, it survives, but sooner or later it fractures. That fracture is what the world calls crazy. Carl Jung wrote, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents." Eli inherited that tragedy not only through blood but through silence. His father's rage was a symptom of his own unlived life. His mother's silence was grief swallowed whole. Eli absorbed both, carrying the shadows they could not face. And here lies the hidden psychology. When a child carries more than he should, his mind builds masks to cope, but those same masks become prisons, and the prisoner eventually breaks. The symbols reveal the truth. The chameleon, changing so often it forgets its true color. The mask, polished enough to fool the world, heavy enough to suffocate the wearer. The burnt-out room, standing but unlivable. These are not just poetic images. They are blueprints of collapse. They explain why adults one day feel like strangers to themselves, why they spiral into paranoia, rage, or despair. This is how people go crazy, not from sudden weakness, but from years of enforced adaptation. A child who erases himself grows into an adult, who cannot find himself. A child who learns silence grows into an adult haunted by voices. A child who wears masks too long grows into an adult who forgets his own face. Ely's madness was not random. It was the inevitable outcome of survival strategies that worked in childhood but poisoned him in adulthood. And as the mask began to crack, as the hollow space inside grew louder, the unraveling could no longer be stopped. What began as adaptation was already turning into collapse. The chameleon had lost his color, and the child who vanished was demanding to be seen again. Why do people go crazy? The answer is not a single event, not one sudden break. It is the long collision between masks and memories, between survival strategies and suppressed truths. Jung gave us the language, the false self, the persona, and the shadow. The false self is the mask you wear to be accepted. The persona is the role you play to keep the world at peace. The shadow is everything you bury, the rage, the grief, the need that never disappears. And when the mask grows too heavy, when the shadow grows too large, the self begins to fracture. That fracture is what the world calls madness. Because trauma never vanishes, left unspoken, it does not fade. It hides, it ferments, it waits. The child learns to silence the pain, the adult learns to deny it, but the nervous system cannot be fooled. Each unprocessed wound is stored like a charge, waiting for release. The human psyche is a tapestry. It can stretch, it can bend, but it cannot hold infinite weight. When the threads tear, the unraveling looks like paranoia, like rage, like despair. And what is really happening? The past is breaking through the present. Society responds with labels: anxiety, depression, disorder. But these words skim the surface. They describe symptoms, not causes. They are names for the smoke, not the fire. The real monster is buried pain, the grief that was never wept, the anger that was never allowed, the fear that was never spoken. Without voice, it grows stronger. Without witness, it mutates. And when it finally erupts, it looks like crazy. Modern science confirms what the body has always known. The body keeps the score. The nervous system encodes lessons long before the mind can explain them. A slammed door feels like danger. A raised voice feels like threat. A silence feels like abandonment. Over time, the body writes 3 unshakable beliefs. I am unsafe, I am unworthy, I am unreal. And when you live inside those messages long enough, your grip on reality begins to slip. This is why people go crazy, not because they are weak, but because they have carried too much, too long, with no relief. The mask eventually cracks, the shadow eventually rises. The false self eventually collapses, and when it does, what was hidden comes flooding into the open. From here, the story turns again, from theory to consequence, from explanation to eruption, into the ways this buried pain takes over an adult life. Trauma does not vanish with age. It settles into the body and grows with it. For Ely, the survival strategies of childhood did not stay in childhood. They followed him into adulthood, reshaped his every step, and rewired his very sense of reality. What once kept him safe as a boy became the very poison that eroded him as a man. This is how the past bleeds into the present, how yesterday's silence becomes today's madness. He was hyper-vigilant, always on guard, scanning every room for danger that was no longer there. But his nervous system could not tell the difference. It remained frozen in survival mode. A smile, a joke, a clever response. These were not simple traits. They were defenses. They were masks designed to prevent explosions, to secure approval, to keep him alive. And the mask grew more sophisticated year after year, until the self underneath became almost unreachable. At the core of this mask was a set of beliefs too deep to question. I am unsafe. I am unworthy. I am not real. These phrases lived in his bones. They were not ideas but instincts carried forward from nights spent tiptoeing on floorboards, from meals served on battlegrounds, from truths that were denied again and again. What happens when such beliefs shape an entire adulthood? Every relationship becomes fragile. Every silence feels like rejection. Every moment carries the weight of danger. The unraveling began quietly. Insomnia stretched into endless nights. A sense of wrongness lingered even in calm spaces. Paranoia crept in, rage erupted, self-hatred took root. The collapse was not sudden. It was step by step, symptom by symptom, until the structure of his mind could no longer hold. He sought help once. He told the therapist, "I can't feel anything. My dreams don't make sense. Sometimes I don't recognize myself in the mirror." These were cries for recognition, but they were met with labels: anxiety, depression, labels that touched the surface, but never the root. They named the smoke and ignored the fire. The buried trauma remained untouched, festering in silence. Exhaustion soon overtook him. Pretending costs energy, and Eli's energy was gone. He began talking to himself, holding entire arguments in empty rooms, shouting at voices only he could hear. He carried notebooks filled with frantic scribbles, fragments of thoughts no one else could decipher. Friends whispered, "He's changed." But he had not changed. He had simply run out of strength to maintain the disguise. Madness for Eli was not a dramatic snapping. It was the soul collapsing after years of relentless performance. And then came the search for meaning in chaos. He started believing the voices. He saw patterns in random places. A radio ad became a personal message. A stranger's glance was a warning. The flicker of a light was a sign from the universe. Was he irrational, or was his mind starved for order, creating meaning where none existed? This is what happens when trauma is denied. The psyche builds a new reality to survive the one that feels unbearable. Trauma wears many masks. Sometimes it looks like anxiety. Sometimes it explodes as anger. Sometimes it dresses itself as mystical insight. But beneath every mask is the same child. Screaming words the adult still cannot say. "Notice me, save me, help me." That scream, unheard in childhood, becomes distorted in adulthood until the world calls it madness. And society? Society rarely looks beneath. It fears madness, sensationalizes it, turns suffering into headlines and statistics. People ask, "What went wrong with him?" instead of, "What happened to him?" They see the collapse, but not the years of carrying. They see the outburst, but not the silence that preceded it. This is why people go crazy. Not because they are weak, but because the body remembers what the mind denies. Because the child who tiptoed through danger is now the adult who cannot rest. Because the false self built to survive has finally collapsed under its own weight. Madness is not random. It is the inevitable echo of the past, demanding to be heard in the present. To understand Eli's unraveling, we must see the link clearly. The sleepless nights, the fractured relationships, the paranoia and voices, these are not isolated symptoms. They are the continuation of a story that began in childhood, the direct consequence of wounds left unacknowledged. And only by tracing these threads back can we understand not just Eli, but why people go crazy at all. We have seen how neglect settles like dust on the soul, how silence shapes the nervous system until invisibility feels like the only way to survive. Yet silence cannot hold forever. What has been suppressed will always find a voice, and when it finally breaks through, it rarely does so gently. It comes in a language of chaos, symbols, fragments, and cries from behind locked doors. It comes as madness. Eli did not go mad because he was weak. He went mad because he had been strong for too long. Imagine a dam holding back a flood year after year, solid, unmoving, dependable, until the water behind it grows heavy enough to crack the concrete. Madness was that crack. Jung called it individuation, the slow process of becoming whole by walking into the dark chambers of the self. But from the inside, it felt nothing like theory. It felt like drowning in rooms where every door shook with screams you weren't allowed to open. How long can a human heart carry those screams before it splinters? The truth is simple and brutal. Burying the past never kills it. What is forced underground only multiplies. Grief denied becomes a ghost that lingers. Rage dismissed grows sharp, cutting from within. And when the mask of composure begins to fracture, what spills out is the shadow. The rage once silenced, the grief once dismissed, the whisper that insists, "You were never loved the way you needed." Can anyone ignore that voice forever? The breaking point, Eli turned to paper. His journal became the stage where madness could speak. Chaotic scribbles covered the page, loops and scratches circling the same sentence like an incantation. I didn't deserve this. It was not for clarity, but for permission. Permission to feel anger without apology, to grieve without shame, to let the wound bleed onto paper so the body could breathe again. Later came therapy, but no longer as performance. The first round had been an act, clever insights, polished metaphors, the desperate wish to appear healed. The second time stripped the armor away. There were no brilliant answers, no rehearsed explanations, only tears, only silence, only the trembling truth spoken aloud. I was hurt. He was not cured, but he was no longer wandering in exile. Madness, once feared, revealed itself as messenger. The parts of him once banished as too much did not attack when acknowledged. They sighed in relief, grateful at last to be seen. Healing from that point forward did not come as a single revelation, but as a rhythm of practices, each one small, each one steady. Shadow work was the act of daring to meet the dark, journaling the chaos, tracing the triggers, naming the emotions that had long been forbidden. Reparenting was the slow offering of tenderness to the child within, soothing with consistency, speaking gently, showing up where once no one did. Boundaries and self-compassion were another form of rebellion. Saying no when the body trembled yes, saying yes to rest without guilt. Treating the self not as a burden, but as someone deserving of care. And then there was silence. Sacred silence, different from the numbness of neglect. To sit still, to breathe deeply, to be present without running away. These practices, though ordinary, became a lifeline. Healing was not built in grand declarations, but in whispers repeated until they rewrote the nervous system. 5 minutes of intentional stillness, a hand pressed to the chest, a question asked inward. Which part of me longs to be seen right now? 1 page of writing, unfiltered and raw, ending always with the defiant phrase, I did not deserve this, and my feelings are valid. 1 small boundary chosen each day, as simple as declining an overwhelming request or protecting time for rest. They may look small, but small steps carried out faithfully become revolutions. Isn't it always rhythm, not a single moment, that teaches the body to trust again? And along this path, there were companions. Bessel van der Kolk reminds, in The Body Keeps the Score, that trauma writes itself into the flesh as much as the mind. Robert A. Johnson, in Owning Your Own Shadow, shows that the dark is not to be destroyed, but to be integrated into the whole. Alice Miller, in The Drama of the Gifted Child, reveals how brilliance can disguise abandonment. Carl Jung, in Man and His Symbols, opens the strange language of images, where the unconscious speaks when words fail. Together, these voices echo what Eli's journey revealed. Madness was never the end. It was the eruption of truths too long silenced, the soul refusing to remain invisible, the crack in the dam that allowed life to flow again. Madness was not weakness, it was survival demanding to be heard. And when its message was welcomed, it became not only chaos, but the first fragile step toward becoming whole. Madness is not the end of you. It is the signal that you have carried too much for too long. It is not proof of weakness, but of endurance. When the mask finally cracks, when silence can no longer hold, what rises may look like chaos, but it is also truth. And truth, even when it shatters you, is also what begins to put you back together. You are not broken, you are buried. Healing is not about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before pain taught you to forget. Madness, for all its terror, is also the moment when the truth refuses to stay hidden. It is grief demanding to be felt, rage asking to be heard. The child within insisting, "See me now," and if you can bear to listen even a little, you will find that madness does not destroy you, it delivers you back to yourself. So let this be your reminder. Even in madness there is meaning. Even in the fracture there is life. Even in the silence there is the chance to speak again. I want to ask you, when did your own mask begin to crack? And what small step can you take today to listen to the part of you that longs to be seen? Share it below, because your story matters. And if this message speaks to you, follow the channel so you don't have to walk this path alone.